Getting ready for the event was painstaking now that Elle had met Dean. He was entirely unlike her usual clients, which begged the question, why did he even need her services? Judging by his suit and Rolex, he wasn't short of a few pound, but she was sure he had women lining up to be his date for free. Elle had to remind herself that it wasn't her business, and neither did she care. For the night, she would be his date, pretending to be unaffected by the glitz and glamour, and then she'd return home with enough money to feed them for 2 months, or to pay a couple very overdue bills. As Dean had promised, he was waiting outside the hotel in a Mercedes at 8 p.m. sharp. He'd greeted her by graciously holding the door open, looking more debonair than he had earlier. His short, dark hair was swept back with wax, and the tailor-made suit he wore hugged him in all the right places, giving whisper of the muscles that lay beneath. Elle fought to breathe steadily as she sat beside him in the car, not only overwhelmed at the sight and proximity of him, but also the smell of his rich cologne filling the car. The driver merely acknowledged her with a nod of the head before placing the privacy screen up. "You look amazing," Dean said. The Grecian-style red gown she wore hugged her bust tightly, where Dean's eyes lingered for a second too long. The color complemented her caramel skin. Around the middle, the flowy material bunched under a collection of silver rhinestones, draping down to the floor and flattering her every curve. The way he was looking at her was due only to the fact she'd be hanging off his arm for the night, Elle was sure. He had to give her a thorough check to make sure she fit the bill. "Thank you," she said with a polite smile. "It might be an idea for us to run over our story on the journey there." "Sure." Her voice seemed to rouse Dean from whatever he was thinking. He cleared his throat and diverted his gaze through the window to the city streets. "You're Dean Wallace. You work for a company called Investian, and were born in September of 1980. Your hobbies include watching films, fine dining, and keeping up to date on trends in the stock market. We met at the wedding of Julia and Ronald, mutual family friends, a month ago." Dean nodded, pleased with how she'd remembered it all, and how their backstory had rolled off her tongue. "And you're Eleanor Smith. You work for your father, a real estate mogul, as an accountant. You share much the same interests as I, but with more of an appreciation for the outdoors. When we first met, I approached you first, and you played hard to get. Other than her first name, it was all a load of bullshit, and the idea that her father was a real estate mogul instead of a 6 feet under deadbeat was laughable. But both she and Dean figured it was better to create an alter ego. "All sounds plausible enough to me," Elle said, her accent a little more proper as she prepared to put on a show. "Let's just hope none of your friends need an accountant." "Not friends, but colleagues. And I'm sure they won't. If they do, I'll sweep you away and make the excuse of wanting you to myself," he said, licking his lips lasciviously. It was all part of the act, Elle knew. He had to pretend, just like she, that there was a chemistry between them. But she couldn't help watching the trail of moisture his tongue left behind, and the urge to move closer to him was both sudden and unprofessional. As they left the Mercedes arm in arm, they were swept up in a crowd entering the building. It was grand and old with succinct modern touches, as were most things in central London. The brunt of the event was being held in an upstairs ballroom, and the large entry hall was filled with people accepting welcome drinks as they walked in. A queue built up before the lifts, with attendees trying to avoid the chaos of the stairs. With Elle on his arm, Dean walked to the very front of the queue, no one blinking an eye as he pushed in front and took the next lift. If she hadn't been earning a decent amount of money that night, Elle would have pulled him up. There was nothing more quintessentially British than a queue, and you respected that. The way he'd steamrolled past his colleagues, with them not surprised by his behavior, had a lot to say about his usual behavior. Instead, she simply smiled and climbed into the small space with him, the other guests reluctant to get in with them. They were only going up 2 floors, but Elle hated lifts. As it began to ascend, nausea bit at the lining of her stomach, and her hands were covered in a fine layer of sweat. Discomfort was plain across her features, despite her attempts at smiling. "Are you okay?" Dean asked, brow furrowed in concern. As she struggled to voice her fear, the lift gave a sickening lurch downwards, and the lights flickered. Elle couldn't repress the scream that escaped her throat, and Dean grabbed hold of her arm. Whether to shut her up or provide her with a little support, she didn't know. Either way, she was grateful for the gesture. With one hand gripping her upper arm, Dean's other hand bashed at the flashing keys of the control panel. They'd came to a stop altogether, the dial on the lift flittering between the ground and first floor. "Fuck," Dean cursed, pressing the emergency call button. They were stuck. Elle had always thought there was a possibility she was claustrophobic, but as the lift came to a stop, there was little doubt in her mind. Whilst Dean rang the emergency call button, her chest heaved with quick, shallow breaths, and she struggled to swallow down the acid building in her throat. The space suddenly felt smaller, too small, as her face buzzed with lack of oxygen. "So where are you from?" Dean asked. "Excuse me?" she replied incredulously. "I don't know if you've noticed, but I can barely breathe." Being snappy with her clients wasn't part of the deal, and she often kept her patience if she could help it, but her mind only had room for all-consuming fear at that moment. Worries of her behavior were pushed firmly aside. "In my experience, drawing attention to it only makes it far worse," he said with a shrug. As the emergency call was finally answered, a bored voice droned over the lift's intercom. Dean calmly explained their predicament, acting as though they weren't stuck in a confined space, the walls enclosing on them every passing second. "We'll have a technician with you in the next half hour," the ambiguous voice promised, "so please remain calm and seated. Do not try to exit the lift." Like that had even crossed my mind, she thought exasperatedly, wringing her hands as she leant against the lift wall. 30 minutes was torturously long to be stuck with someone she didn't know, especially under the circumstances. "Stratford. I'm from Stratford." "I see," Dean said, absorbing the information with a subtle nod. "Do you have any siblings? Pets? Who of your family are you closest to?" Dean threw the barrage of questions at her in quick succession, and subconsciously it seemed to help. Her thoughts were diverted to remembering each question he asked and providing him an accurate answer. "No siblings or pets. Only ever been close to my grandmother. And son." "Your son," Dean repeated, eyebrows raising a fraction. "Do you only escort, or is this just a sideline from your career?" At his insinuation, she could have laughed. Escorting was a desperate man or woman's game, and any self-respecting person with a career surely wouldn't bother. Elle could see him studying her, her previous answer having ignited interest, and wondered if a part of him was disgusted. Perhaps he thought a mother should be doing something more respectful with her time, that she should have stability enough not to resort to this. She'd told herself the same many times, and the guilt weighed heavily on her shoulders. "No career," she said with a blush, hesitant to admit it to the clearly successful, career-driven man before her. "It's difficult to develop one when you have a child at 17, little time, money, or opportunity to further yourself." Whilst she spoke, Dean watched her attentively, offering her a solemn nod as he pursed his lips. Without realizing, Elle's panic attack slowly subsided, her heart rate descending and the shudders of her extremities slowing instead to steady shaking. "Is that why you escort? Lack of opportunity and money?" "What about you, huh?" she asked, hoping to shift the attention to him instead. "Why does someone like you even need an escort? You must have women lining up to date you." "I'll choose to take that as a compliment, so thank you, but I asked you a question first." Dean's smile spread wide across his features, but Elle didn't miss the ounce of pity he wore in his eyes. She hated it with every fiber of her being. That look was given to her all too often, and she didn't need or want it. Pity wouldn't help her. "Money is the motivator for me. I gave up on my dreams so I can build his. My chances of earning a similar wage in a more dignified role are slim to none, and I can't get by on any less. Previous to this, we got by on my grandmother's pension, and I worked nights at a supermarket. There were some days just before I started escorting that all I had to feed my son was bread and water. He went to bed, clutching his stomach with hunger. I vowed never, ever to put him through that again. I can't be selfish, and if this is what it takes to provide for him, this is what I'll do. The pity fed on her words, growing until his eyes were brimming with it. Elle wished she hadn't shared, or had answered with something generic instead of honestly giving a piece of herself. But it wasn't in her nature. She gave too much to people, and she thought perhaps that was part of the problem. Hadn't she given too much to her parents when they were alive? To Trent's dad before he left? She was a giver, and people only ever walked all over givers. I can't trust people, Dean said simply. Hiring an escort for a date is far less risky than another woman who is usually more interested in my money than me. At least with you, I already know you're in it for the money. Both of their admissions sat stagnantly in the air as they acknowledged each other in silence. Elle would never understand things from his perspective, or how difficult it was for him to question every relationship he had, because she would never have a substantial amount of money. And Dean wouldn't understand what it was like to resort to anything to keep his child fed. Any children he had would surely eat 3 square meals a day, with an empty pantry being a phenomenon to them. You seem like an intelligent woman, Elle. There's little doubt in my mind that someday someone will see that and give you an opportunity to make something of yourself. Fuck, Elle thought, as she tried to rid of the tears culminating in the corners of her eyes. She didn't often cry. Even as a child, it was more likely for her to get angry than sad, but Dean had just voiced the one hope she was holding on to, that someone would see potential in her and save her from living on the breadline. As she struggled to find the words to reply, the lift gave another sickening lurch and ascended, bringing Elle back to the realization that they were stuck. All fixed. A chirpy technician's voice sounded. We found a power outage in one of the generators, and all should be okay from now on. Whatever the technician said, there was no way in hell that Elle would be going back into a lift that evening. She and Dean exited it arm in arm, the heart-to-heart they'd shared unspoken of as they set to business, and headed in the direction of the event room. Investion's charity gala was more ostentatious than Elle had dreamed. The event raised money for an abundance of charities, from those dedicated to congenital heart defects to supporting families via food banks, all handpicked by the CEO himself as they were close to his heart. Elle had asked where the CEO was, thinking he was perhaps the one person here she'd like to meet if he were this charitable. With a knowing grin, Dean had told her he was the sort to mingle, and she'd undoubtedly talked to him at some point during the evening. Most difficult for Elle was pretending she was a part of this world, where champagne and caviar were served by poker-faced waiters, and people spoke of month-long trips to the continent or skiing in the Alps. It all left a bitter taste on her tongue, particularly the caviar, which she thought was horrendously overrated and tasted like arse. So Charles and I were preparing for our annual trip to Fiji when one of the help comes to us insisting on a pay rise. An insufferable woman in her late 50s scoffed, commanding the attention of the group surrounding her. Well, £1 an hour increase would really make no difference to our pockets, but the woman scrubs toilets. If she'd wanted any more than minimum wage, she ought to have developed more useful skills. Elle wanted to wring the woman's neck. She'd clearly never had to work for anything and sat on a fortune that provided her with ample time for vacations, yet little need to work. Whoever the help was, Elle could sympathize. Lack of empathy from rich employers was rife, especially in big corporations, and it wasn't any wonder staff turnover was so high. Biting her tongue had been near impossible, but she'd managed it. When the insufferable woman left, whispers about her traveled through the dispersing group. Apparently this sort of impertinence was common for her, and her attitude hadn't earned her many fans at Investion. Does she work with you? Elle asked. Paulette? She'd an investor. If she worked with us, she'd have been fired a long time ago. Standing directly behind her, Dean's low voice sent a shiver down her spine, his lips grazing at the sensitive skin of her ear. His hands brushed down her arms, smoothing down the goosebumps that erupted over her. This was all part of the charade. She'd done it all before, but with him it felt far more natural. Usually she'd fight the urge to vomit, and her skin would be crawling, but with him, Elle didn't have to act when she smiled at the gesture. It was genuine. The pair moved fluidly through the crowds, discussing menial things that Elle had little interest in. It was patently obvious that Dean was in the same predicament, merely nodding his head and offering small contributions to conversation simply to be polite. No one had questioned their relationship, instead commenting on what a lovely couple they made. Each person they spoke to complimented Elle on her dress and hair, not knowing it had cost less than what they undoubtedly earned in an hour. She took each compliment with a forced smile and interacted with everyone Dean introduced her to. It was bizarre for her to be earning looks of admiration, particularly from the men. Although she didn't doubt her own appeal, the sorts of people she spoke to this evening usually looked down on her, particularly when she was in public with her son. Her caramel skin, which was usually garnered derogatory comments from people like those surrounding her, was instead heralded as beautiful, exotic. The illusion of her having wealth was the only thing to stop them from tearing her down, she was sure. When she'd exhausted herself from being implausibly polite, her cheeks aching from smiling, Dean pulled Elle to the bar to grab a drink. They both had a glass of white wine, although she'd have killed for a vodka and Coke, and sipped it in one of the quieter sections of the event. You've been brilliant tonight, Dean beamed. I know it's your forte to do so, but you've got a way with people. Not many people can manage to charm a full room of Investion investors and partners. So none of the people here are your colleagues? She asked, bemused. You must be rather important to be here, schmoozing the investors then. Somewhat, he said with an uneven smirk. Elle's heart beat a little faster at the sight of it. Have you ever thought about working in customer care? Of course she had. Elle was aware she had the ability to appear happy and bubbly, even if she was in the foulest of moods, but it paid even less than the supermarket she'd worked at. Instead of telling Dean where to shove his unneeded suggestion, she simply downed the rest of her drink and gave him a smile that didn't reach her eyes. And have you ever thought about going into career counseling? 'Cause we seem to have spoken about my work a lot this evening. I'm sorry, he said, the edges of his mouth downturning infinitesimally. I merely mean that I think you've a knack for it, but I won't mention it again. Locking his lips and throwing away the key, Dean guided her towards the dance floor. His dancing was as smooth as the rest of him, his feet gliding across the floor in time with the music and with little difficulty. Elle didn't much enjoy dancing, but the way his body felt against hers swayed her. This would likely be the only night like this in her life, and she'd be damned if she didn't enjoy it. After what had been an overall enjoyable night, Dean dropped her off outside the hotel. The awkward exchange of money had come shortly before she left the car. She counted the money as discreetly as she could with his eyes upon her, and could have choked as the 50-pound notes climbed in excess of her fee. You've made a mistake, she spluttered. That's double my fee. Well, I thought you did an especially good job. Elle couldn't stand being seen as a charity case, but she needed the money. Swallowing the lump growing in her throat, she placed the money carefully inside her purse and tried not to excite herself over the difference it could make to her financial situation. Thank you, Dean. And not just for the money, but for tonight. I genuinely enjoyed myself. As did I, he said, his playful gaze dropping just a second to her lips before flitting back up. Here's my number. I have a job opportunity you may be interested in. I think you'd be perfect for the role. Give me a call, and we can have an informal chat. Struggling to contain a hysteric laugh, Elle toyed with the card he handed her. She'd had many clients at the end of the night try to goad her into more illicit services, and she was sure this was a case of much the same. He'd given her the additional money to butter her up, and the job opportunity was undoubtedly the usual offered to her by other clients. No matter how desperate her situation, Elle wouldn't sell her body. Thanks, but no thanks. It's not what you're thinking. I'm not asking you for anything like that, Dean said pointedly, acknowledging the doubt flickering in her brown eyes. Please just give me a call sometime, and we can talk about it. If it's not your thing, no harm, no foul, but it pays well. Elle left the car sure that she wouldn't take him up on his offer, but pocketed the card nonetheless. Part of her wanted to find out more about his proposition. He hadn't come across as a pervert, and maybe he was honest when he said his intentions weren't what she thought. And in any case, another part of her wanted to have an excuse to speak to him again. With the money sitting heavily in her purse, Elle was reluctant to stay any longer than needed at the hotel. After Dean dropped her off, she changed, packed her things, and checked out. Thanks to local tube connections, it took her very little time to get home. When she arrived at her grandmother's house in the early hours, a horrifying sight awaited her. The handle sat limply on the door, which hung off its hinges, giving clear view to the destruction inside. Whoever had broken into the house had cleaned them out, nothing but mess left in their wake. But Elle couldn't give a crap. What mattered to her wasn't their material goods, but the safety of her family. Carrying her as swiftly as they could, her legs seemed to move of their own accord. She clambered over piles of paper and trinkets discarded from the drawers that had previously sat in the hallway and ran up the stairs. Trent's room was nearest, located just opposite hers, and she opened the door with her heart in her mouth. Everything was intact, not a thing out of place. Moonlight shone through gaps in the blinds, casting eerie shadows upon the walls that had Elle even more on edge. It illuminated her son's small figure, and she let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. Checking the room thoroughly, to make sure the intruders weren't hiding in here, her heart drummed unevenly against her chest. Trent lay in bed, completely unaware of the chaos that had erupted beneath him as he slept. And once Elle was through checking his room, she moved onto her grandmother's and her own, and every other nook and cranny she could search for intruders. Granny May was as unaware as Trent, her soft snores bouncing from her bedroom walls. Elle was thankful that, although they'd been burgled, those close to her were safe. Once it was apparent to her that no harm had come of anyone, fury blanketed her. She stood in the lounge and observed the damage, her hands balled into fists as she shook without being cold. How could anyone do this, she thought. We have nothing. What we did have had no value. It's senseless. There were only 4 hours until the other two would wake, expecting to have Sunday breakfast sat around a family table that they no longer owned. It didn't make sense for her to wake them any earlier to tell them. For now, they would sleep and be blissfully unaware that any of this had happened. Being dealt this card left Elle with little choice. The money she earned that night couldn't replace all they had lost, even if she didn't have bills and food to consider. On Monday, she'd called Dean to take him up on his offer, whatever it entailed. Once she had found a way to set the door back in its frame, Elle picked up a dustpan and brush and set to work on clearing away the debris. It would, she hoped, work to alleviate some of the stress of the break-in. It's a blessing in disguise, really. I'd wanted to get rid of that bloody coffee table ever since your great-grandmother gave it to us as a wedding gift. May had awoken before Trent and, despite her initial shock, had taken the burglary in good humor. It was a foreign concept to Elle. How could she have nearly everything she owned and worked hard for snatched away, yet remain endlessly positive? I think you're overlooking the fact that we have no way to replace our furniture, Nan, Elle mused as she massaged her temples. We'll find a way, darling. We always do. With yet another burden on her back, Elle didn't know how much more she could handle. She felt as though she was balanced on the edge of a precipice, ready to fall. All it would take was one more problem, One small gust of air to push her over and towards breaking point. "You're right," Elle said, although she believed the opposite. Trent was watching her expectantly, and she knew he was banking on her being optimistic. If she said everything was okay, then Trent knew everything would be. As May bustled off to put the kettle on, walking with a swift determination that all 70-year-old women seemed to possess, Elle sat on the floor of the lounge. It was startlingly bare, every small sound reverberating from the walls as though to mock their lack of belongings. "What if they come back, Mum?" Trent asked. He cast a cautionary look towards the kitchen. Even as he was embroiled in fear, his first instinct was to make sure to protect May from the discomfort of being aware of it. "They won't," she assured him, pulling her son in for a hug. She wished there was more to be said to comfort him, but short of adding, "We have nothing left for them to take," she didn't know what else to say. "Are we going to call the police?" "Yes, baby," Elle said, smoothing down his dark, wiry hair. "They'll find who did this. Don't you worry, that handsome head of yours." Although she didn't truly believe it, the white lie would help Trent sleep that night. The three of them waited in the lounge for the police to arrive, squatted on the floor and drinking Earl Grey. Much like when the electric meter ran out or the TV company cut them off, they whiled away the hours by playing cards and listening to May's stories of her youth. It was bittersweet, as it always was. A spate of recent burglaries in the area meant the police were both saddened yet unsurprised when they arrived. P.C. Bradshaw had assured them he would do all he could to use the evidence they found, but Elle knew that even if they caught the bastards, there would be little chance of them getting their things back. No matter if they had money, the family trinkets and heirlooms couldn't be replaced, but it would have made the ordeal easier to digest, and provided a quality security system to have avoided the whole thing. The following day, Elle would have to swallow her pride. She toyed with the card in her pocket, wondering what, if anything, Dean could offer her.